August 1944. The Falaise Pocket, Normandy. The summer air is heavy with the suffocating stench of burning diesel, spent cordite, and pulverized earth. Inside the cramped, stifling hull of a Panzer Kampfwagen V, the feared Tiger tank, a German commander wipes sweat from his face and peers through his Zeiss optics. His crew is physically broken but combat effective. Over the past 72 hours of fighting through the dense French hedgerows, they have executed a textbook defensive withdrawal. The chalk marks tallied beside the breech of their 88mm gun tell a story of absolute lethality. 12 enemy tanks engaged, 12 enemy tanks destroyed. By every traditional metric of military engagement, it is a triumph of armored warfare. The German crew has relied on their superior range, heavy armor, and elite gunnery training to dominate the battlefield. But as the morning fog and lingering battle smoke clear across the scarred valley, a creeping dread settles over the commander. Cresting the distant ridge, accompanied by the low mechanical growl of radial engines, new silhouettes emerge. Not a handful of survivors, but dozens of fresh M4 Shermans, advancing in a relentless wave. The tactical brilliance of the morning has already been erased by an industrial leviathan. To understand the nightmare awaiting the German armored corps in the summer of 1944, one must look back to the frozen steppes of the Soviet Union in late 1941. During the opening phases of the Second World War, the dreaded German blitzkrieg was not built on heavily armored behemoths. It relied on speed, radio coordination, and combined arms. The Panzer IIs and IIs that conquered France were relatively light, nimble, and mechanically reliable. But Operation Barbarossa shattered that paradigm. When the Wehrmacht pushed deep into Russian territory, they collided with a terrifying new reality: the Soviet T-34 and the heavy KV-1. German anti-tank shells simply bounced off the thick, sloped armor of these new Soviet designs, found themselves outgunned and intensely vulnerable. The psychological shock that rippled back to the high command in Berlin was absolute. The Führer demanded an immediate and overwhelming technological response. Germany would no longer rely on light, easily mass-produced cavalry tanks. They would build rolling fortresses. They would mandate invincibility. This directive birthed the era of the big cats. Leading engineering firms like Henschel, Porsche, and Krupp were tasked with designing machines that prioritized extreme survivability and devastating firepower above all else. The result was the Panzer Kampfwagen V Tiger, introduced in 1942, followed later by the Panther. These machines were marvels of lethality. The Tiger boasted armor over 100 millimeters thick and was armed with the legendary 88mm gun, an anti-aircraft weapon adapted to punch through enemy steel at ranges where Allied tanks could not even return fire. However, this obsession with technological supremacy carried a fatal, unseen flaw. German manufacturing in the early 1940s was not a modern, streamlined system. It was deeply rooted in a tradition of handwork, artisanal craftsmanship. German factories operated more like vast, meticulous workshops than highly efficient assembly lines. Machinists milled parts to incredibly precise tolerances. If a piece did not fit perfectly, it was manually filed and adjusted by a master craftsman until it did. Because of this bespoke manufacturing philosophy, parts were rarely universally interchangeable. The tanks were over-engineered, featuring incredibly complex components like interleaved road wheels, which provided a remarkably smooth ride for accurate gunnery, but were a nightmare to repair in the mud and freezing snow of the front lines. It took up to 300,000 man-hours to complete a single Tiger tank. Germany was betting its entire national survival on a specific mathematical gamble: that a small number of technologically flawless, heavily armored machines operated by elite crews could destroy a vast horde of inferior enemies. They believed quality would simply erase quantity. 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, a vastly different philosophy was taking shape. In December 1941, when the United States was thrust into a two-front global war, the American military was critically under-equipped. Its armored forces were practically non-existent, relying on obsolete light tanks and the stopgap M3 Lee. Yet, what America lacked in immediate frontline armor, it made up for with a terrifying strategic asset: the largest, most technologically integrated, and geographically secure industrial infrastructure on the planet. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called for an arsenal of democracy. In response, the automotive capital of the world ceased the production of civilian passenger cars. In Detroit, giants of industry like Chrysler, Ford, and General Motors retrofitted their massive assembly lines for a singular purpose: the ruthless, uninterrupted mass production of war material. The American planners understood a fundamental truth about global conflict. They did not need a perfect tank. They needed a good enough tank. It had to be mechanically reliable, easy to train on, and most importantly, capable of being produced by the thousands and shipped across an ocean. The manifestation of this doctrine was the M4 Sherman. Weighing roughly 30 tons, the Sherman was a medium tank. It lacked the impenetrable armor of a Tiger and carried a short-barreled 75mm gun that was adequate, but entirely outclassed in a direct duel with heavy German armor. Yet, the Sherman was an absolute masterpiece of industrial engineering. The Americans instituted rigid, uncompromising standardization. A factory in Michigan could build a hull, a foundry in Ohio could cast a turret, and a plant in New York could assemble the radial engine. When those components met on a final assembly line, they fit perfectly. No filing, no custom adjustments, no master craftsman required. If a Sherman's transmission was destroyed in combat, a crew of mechanics with standard tools could swap in a replacement directly from a supply crate in a matter of hours. Furthermore, the design of the Sherman was explicitly dictated by logistics. A 60-ton German Tiger only had to roll onto a European flatbed railcar to reach the front. An American Sherman had to travel by train to the East Coast, survive a U-boat-infested crossing of the Atlantic, and then be unloaded at damaged ports in Britain or North Africa. The Sherman was specifically dimensioned to fit exactly into these shipping constraints. By late 1942, the Chrysler Detroit tank arsenal alone was pushing out hundreds of tanks a month. Assembly lines ran 24 hours a day, bathed in the blinding light of arc welders, operated by a new workforce of women and men too old to draft. Trains loaded with miles of olive-drab steel snaked toward the eastern seaboard in a ceaseless mechanical rhythm. The stage was set for a brutal collision in the fields of Western Europe, a clash not just of armor, but of two entirely incompatible visions of how to fight and win a modern war. When these two differing doctrines collided in the dense hedgerows of Normandy and the sprawling fields of France, the tactical reality was swift and brutal. American armored commanders quickly realized that a head-on engagement with a Panther or a Tiger was practically a death sentence. The high-velocity 75mm and later 88mm guns of the German heavies could punch clean through the frontal glacis of a Sherman from well beyond a kilometer away. Often, the first warning an American crew had of a German presence was the deafening crack of a hyper-velocity armor-piercing shell obliterating the tank next to them. But American tactical doctrine adapted to the reality of their machinery. They did not fight duels. They fought swarm engagements. The standard American tank platoon consisted of 5 Shermans. When a lone German heavy was encountered, the American response was dictated by cold, calculated geometry. 1 or 2 Shermans would immediately drop back, laying down suppressing fire and firing high-explosive white phosphorus shells to blind the highly superior German optics. Meanwhile, the remaining 3 Shermans would push hard to the flanks. They utilized their superior turret traverse speed powered by a system that could spin the turret a full 360 degrees in under 15 seconds, significantly faster than the systems of many German counterparts. The singular goal was to maneuver around the impenetrable frontal armor of the Panzer and fire into the highly vulnerable, thinner side or rear armor plates. It was a deadly mathematical equation. American commanders accepted that in an engagement with a Panther or Tiger, they might lose 1, perhaps 2 Shermans to secure the kill. The air inside the M4 during these flanking maneuvers was filled with the deafening roar of the engine, the suffocating smell of cordite, and the metallic clatter of ejecting shells. It was terrifying, intimate combat. But tactically, losing 2 mass-produced medium tanks to destroy a single irreplaceable German heavy was an exchange rate the Allied command could afford to maintain. The Wehrmacht could not. This battlefield calculus was underpinned by a stark technological divergence. To the German command, a tank was an elite weapon system meant to be perfected. To the Americans, it was an automotive platform meant to be sustained. The Panzer Kampfwagen V Panther was arguably the most lethal medium-heavy tank of the war. Its sloped armor and high-velocity gun made it a terror on the defense. But underneath its pristine, menacing exterior lay a mechanical nightmare. The Panther weighed nearly 45 tons, yet it was driven by a transmission originally designed for a 30-ton machine. The final drives were notoriously fragile. If a German driver attempted to pivot the massive tank under high torque, the immense strain would frequently shear the gear teeth, rendering the war machine instantly immobile and useless. Furthermore, the German interleaved road wheels, a complex system of overlapping metal discs, designed to distribute weight and improve ride quality for gunnery, were highly susceptible to the European environment. In the freezing mud of the autumn and winter, the spaces between the overlapping wheels would pack with wet earth and ice overnight. By dawn, the track system was frozen solid to the ground. Fixing a broken inner road wheel meant a maintenance crew had to remove up to 5 outer wheels first, a grueling, hours-long process often attempted under artillery fire. Contrast this with the technological pragmatism of the American M4 Sherman. The Sherman rode on a vertical volute spring suspension system. It was agricultural in its blunt simplicity. If a road wheel was destroyed by a landmine or a shell, an American maintenance crew could simply unbolt the single damaged bogie assembly, lift a new one into place with a recovery vehicle, and have the tank rolling again in a matter of hours. Inside the engine bay, the difference was even more pronounced. Many Shermans were powered by the Ford GAA, a massive aluminum block V8, or the incredibly reliable Continental radial engine. These engines were manufactured with massive tolerances. They did not require specialized synthetic oils or the delicate touch of a master mechanic. They required standard fuel, standard grease, and forward momentum. When an American tank took a non-catastrophic hit, the surviving crew bailed out and the ordnance battalions moved in. Because every Sherman part was identically standardized, mechanics engaged in rapid battlefield cannibalization. They would take the functioning turret of a mobility-killed Sherman, mount it on the intact chassis of a tank with a destroyed gun, and send a fully operational, hybrid vehicle right back to the front line. The German approach to technology produced absolute lethality on the drafting table. The American approach produced relentless reliability in the mud. And as the war dragged into the autumn of 1944, that reliability began to fundamentally alter the psychology of the men fighting the war. The tactical and technological disparities between the two forces were ultimately governed by an even larger, more unforgiving mechanism: logistics. The lifeblood of an armored division is not simply the courage of its crews, but the speed at which its losses can be replaced. By the late summer of 1944, the American logistical train had evolved into an unprecedented feat of global organization. To sustain the rapid advance of Allied armor across France, the United States military established the Red Ball Express. It was a staggering highway system of continuous one-way traffic. Over 5,000 trucks, driven largely by exhausted but relentless African-American quartermaster units, operated 24 hours a day. They drove through the night with headlights taped down to mere slits, running a continuous loop from the Normandy beachheads right to the very edge of the front lines. They delivered millions of gallons of high-octane fuel and thousands of tons of heavy ammunition. Trailing right behind this endless convoy of supplies were the massive M25 tank transporters, universally known as dragon wagons. When an American armored column took casualties, the battlefield was not simply abandoned. These tracked machines, built on modified Sherman chassis and equipped with heavy winches and A-frame cranes, operated like industrial scavengers. They hooked onto disabled, burned, or immobilized Shermans and dragged them directly back to mobile repair depots situated just miles behind the fighting. An American tank that had its tracks blown off by a mine on a Tuesday morning would be towed, repaired, rearmed. The German reality was a stark, agonizing contrast. By 1944, Allied air superiority over Western Europe was absolute. P-47 Thunderbolts and Hawker Typhoons roamed the skies, strafing anything that moved in daylight. German rail lines were constantly shattered. Consequently, a replacement Tiger or Panther tank had to be unloaded dozens, sometimes hundreds, of miles behind the front. It then had to drive to the battle under its own power, burning precious, severely rationed synthetic fuel and wearing out its notoriously fragile transmission before it ever fired a shot. If a 60-ton Tiger suffered a mechanical breakdown or slipped a track in a muddy ditch during a retreat, it required 2 or 3 other heavy towing vehicles to pull it free. Because the Wehrmacht was chronically short of specialized heavy recovery half-tracks like the FAMO, an immobilized Tiger was often a dead Tiger. The highly trained crew would systematically pack the pristine interior of their technological marvel with high explosives, detonate it to prevent capture, and begin the long, humiliating walk back to German lines. The weight of this logistical imbalance began to crush the psychology of the German armored corps. These were seasoned, hardened veterans, Many had survived the brutal freezing carnage of the Eastern Front. They possessed a deep, almost arrogant confidence in their gunnery skills and the sheer survivability of their heavy armor. They knew how to kill tanks. It was not the terror of being outfought. It was the suffocating dread of industrial mathematics. In bunker command posts and heavily camouflaged tents, German commanders penned after-action reports that bordered on despair. Destroying 12 Shermans while losing only one of their own. It was a spectacular tactical victory. Yet, the letters sent home to Germany revealed the grim truth. The American formation would reappear on the exact same road, not only replenished to its original strength, but often heavily reinforced. The sky rained artillery, the roads rumbled with endless convoys, and the horizon was perpetually choked with the dust of fresh Detroit steel. Their elite training and their masterfully engineered war machines were entirely meaningless, but as disposable, mass-produced ammunition. This psychological fracturing, born from the sheer inability to stem the mechanical tide, would soon be tested in the massive, desperate armored clashes that awaited them as the Allies pushed relentlessly toward the German border. That psychological breaking point, the realization that Germany was fighting an unwinnable war of industrial attrition, arrived in the damp, rolling hills of northeastern France. It was September 1944. The Allied breakout from Normandy had sent the Wehrmacht reeling eastward in a chaotic, bloody retreat. General George Patton's Third Army was racing toward the German border, stretching its own supply lines to the absolute limit. Adolf Hitler ordered a massive, coordinated armored counteroffensive. He committed his newly formed Panzer brigades to the strike. These units were equipped with brand new Panther tanks, rushed directly from the assembly lines in the Ruhr Valley. They represented the last great operational reserve of German armor in the West. Command of this vital thrust fell to General Hasso von Manteuffel and the 5th Panzer Army. Their target was a small, seemingly insignificant French farming village named Aricourt. On the morning of September 18th, a thick, blinding fog settled over the Lorraine Valley. The weather grounded the dreaded American fighter bombers, giving the German panzers a critical window to strike. The heavy Maybach engines of over 200 German tanks roared to life, their wide tracks churning the wet earth as they advanced toward the American lines. Manteuffel's commanders expected to catch the Americans entirely off guard and crush them beneath the weight of superior German steel. Instead, they drove blindly into a perfectly executed meat grinder. Waiting for them in the fog was Combat Command A of the U.S. 4th Armored Division. The American commanders used the heavy mist to neutralize the Panther's greatest advantage, its lethal long-range 75mm gun. Because visibility was reduced to mere yards, the engagement distances shrank from over a kilometer to point-blank range. When the gray silhouettes of the Panthers finally emerged from the mist, the combat was sudden and intimately violent. At ranges of less than 200 yards, the frontal armor of the Panther was no longer impenetrable. American Sherman crews, utilizing their gyroscopic gun stabilizers, fired accurately while on the move, a technological feat the German tanks could not match. The Shermans darted between the tree lines and farmhouses, utilizing their fast turret traverse to snap off rounds into the vulnerable side plating of the advancing German heavies. American M18 Hellcat tank destroyers, lightly armored but incredibly fast, ambushed the heavier Panthers, firing high-velocity rounds before tearing away into the fog. The Battle of Aricourt raged for 11 brutal days. It became the largest tank versus tank engagement on the Western Front up to that point. When the skies finally cleared and the smoke drifted away from the shattered French countryside, the scale of the German disaster became visibly apparent. The fields were littered with the scorched, twisted husks of over 200 German tanks and assault guns. Hitler's elite new Panzer brigades had been entirely gutted. But the true climax of Aricourt was not just the tactical victory. It was what happened in the days immediately following the slaughter. General von Manteuffel immediately petitioned Berlin for replacements. He needed new Panthers, new engines, and seasoned crews to rebuild his shattered striking force. The response from the German High Command was a deafening silence. The trains were not coming. The factories in Germany were buckling under the weight of relentless Allied daylight bombing raids, and the few tanks that were being produced were being diverted to the collapsing Eastern Front. The loss of those 200 tanks at Aricourt was a permanent, irreplaceable amputation of German combat power. Across the front line, the American 4th Armored Division had also taken heavy casualties, losing dozens of Shermans and lightly armored vehicles in the savage close-quarters fighting. Yet, as German commanders peered through their binoculars from the distant ridges, they witnessed an industrial miracle that defied their comprehension. The American lines did not thin, they did not weaken. Within hours of the fighting subsiding, the heavy M25 Dragon wagons were already dragging the burned-out American hulls away from the front. More terrifyingly, the railheads just miles behind the American lines were actively unloading flat cars. Brand new M4 Shermans, painted in fresh olive drab and fully loaded with ammunition, were rolling down the ramps. Replacement crews, trained in the vast armored centers of Fort Knox and the California desert, climbed into the hatches. Within a week of the battle's conclusion, the 4th Armored Division was not just rebuilt. It was back to full combat strength, its engines idling, ready to resume the offensive. The German armored corps had thrown their absolute best machinery into a concentrated, surprise offensive, and it had simply bounced off the unyielding anvil of American logistics. The realization was stark and horrifying. They could destroy an American tank division on Monday, and by Friday, they would have to fight it all over again. Driven to the edge of operational collapse, the German High Command realized that localized counterattacks were futile. If they were to survive, they needed one final, massive, catastrophic blow to shatter the Allied supply lines completely, setting the stage for the most desperate winter gamble of the war. That desperate winter gamble materialized on December 16, 1944, in the freezing, snow-choked forests of the Ardennes. It was Operation Wacte Marine, known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. For months, Adolf Hitler had ruthlessly stripped the eastern front of its armor and hoarded every drop of synthetic aviation fuel the crumbling Reich could produce. He amassed a striking force of over 1,000 tanks, assault guns, and tank destroyers. At the tip of this armored spear was the 6th Panzer Army, equipped with the ultimate, terrifying manifestation of German armored philosophy, the Panzer Kampfwagen VIU-SFB, the fearsome King Tiger. Weighing nearly 70 tons, the King Tiger was practically invulnerable from the front. Its sloped armor could deflect any anti-tank round the Allies possessed, and its long-barreled 88mm gun could obliterate a Sherman from miles away. When the offensive began, supported by a massive artillery barrage and cloaked under a heavy winter blizzard that grounded Allied aircraft, the German armored columns punched violently through the thinly held American lines. For a few intoxicating days, the German High Command allowed themselves to believe the impossible. The Panzers were racing toward the Meuse River. American units were surrounded at Bastogne. It felt briefly like the glorious blitzkrieg days of 1940 had returned. But this illusion was built on a foundation of sand. The German operational plan possessed a fatal, uncorrectable flaw. They did not have enough fuel to reach their objectives. The entire offensive relied on the gamble that German spearheads would capture massive American gasoline dumps along the way. They did not. As the German heavy tanks pushed deeper into the Belgian snow, the unforgiving reality of their over-engineered machinery set in. The King Tigers burned fuel at an astronomical rate, gallons per mile, not miles per gallon. Their massive weight destroyed the narrow, icy forest roads, causing traffic jams that stretched for miles. Transmissions, strained by the mud and the bitter cold, began to shatter. And then, the American industrial giant reacted. There was no widespread panic at the Supreme Headquarters. Instead, there was a calculated mechanical response. General George S. Patton achieved a logistical miracle that the German command considered mathematically impossible. In the middle of a blizzard, he pivoted the entire Third Army, tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of supply trucks 90 degrees and marched them north to strike the flank of the German Bulge. With them came the unending tide of Detroit steel. As the German offensive bogged down in the snow, starved of fuel and spare parts, the railheads behind the American lines went into overdrive. Trains hauled fresh M4 Shermans straight from the ports of Antwerp and Cherbourg. Ordnance crews worked in sub-zero temperatures, hastily painting the olive-drab tanks with white camouflage or covering them in bedsheets to blend into the snow. On December 23rd, the skies finally cleared. The slaughter was absolute. Swarms of P-47 Thunderbolts descended upon the stalled German columns, dropping high explosives and napalm on the congested roads. But the true heartbreak for the German tank commanders occurred on the ground. Elite units, like Kampfgruppe Piper, found themselves trapped near the village of La Gleize. They possessed the most lethal tanks on the planet, but their fuel gauges read empty. They had no recovery vehicles, no replacement parts. Veteran German crews were forced to do the unthinkable. They drained the radiators, placed thermite grenades in the breeches of their pristine 88mm guns, and abandoned their magnificent King Tigers in the snow. As they retreated on foot, freezing and defeated, they looked back to see the American armored columns advancing. The Shermans were not just pushing them back. They were multiplying. For every American tank the Germans had managed to destroy in the opening days of the offensive, 2 more had seamlessly taken its place. The roads were packed with fresh, fully fueled, fully armed American armor, backed by an endless convoy of supply trucks churning through the slush. The Battle of the Bulge flattened out, and with it, the last operational armored reserve of the Third Reich ceased to exist. The German commanders had fought with tactical brilliance. They had utilized superior optics, heavier armor, and deadlier guns. Yet, they were left standing in the freezing mud, watching an opponent who absorbed their deadliest blows and simply manufactured a new army the next morning. The final reckoning of this industrial slaughter was at hand. The final reckoning of this industrial slaughter arrived not on a single battlefield, but across the crumbling infrastructure of the Third Reich. By the spring of 1945, the German armored corps was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a scattering of localized, desperate holdouts. The great beast of the Wehrmacht had not simply been outmaneuvered. It had been systematically starved to death. The skies over Germany were entirely dominated by Allied heavy bombers. The Ruhr Valley, once the beating industrial heart of the nation, had been reduced to a lunar landscape of ash, cratered concrete, and twisted steel. The massive factory complexes of Krupp, Porsche, and Henschel, where the meticulous, artisanal crafting of the Tiger tanks once took place, now lay in absolute ruin. Roofs were caved in, exposing shattered machinery to the elements. Assembly lines were buried under thousands of tons of masonry. The master machinists, those who had survived the relentless day and night firestorms, were handed cheap disposable Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and sent to the front lines as conscripted infantry. German tank production did not just slow down in those final months. It suffered a violent, catastrophic collapse. Even when a new Panther or Tiger miraculously rolled out of a surviving, heavily fortified underground facility, its existence was practically meaningless. The synthetic oil refineries at Luna and the natural oil fields of Ploiesti had been obliterated. There was simply no fuel to move the heavy machines. Furthermore, the sprawling rail network required to transport these 60-ton behemoths had been shattered into useless, disconnected fragments by roaming squadrons of Allied fighter bombers. 4,000 miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, the contrast was staggering. The American industrial homeland remained entirely untouched by the ravages of war. In Michigan, Ohio, and New York, the factory lights burned brightly, illuminating the night sky without fear of enemy aircraft. There were no air raid sirens to halt the assembly lines. There were no critical shortages of steel, rubber, or copper. The foundries poured molten metal with a terrifying, rhythmic consistency, operating in a relentless 3-shift rotation. The final production numbers of the Second World War tell the definitive story of a conflict decided not by elite individual prowess, but by overwhelming, industrialized mechanical output. Throughout the entirety of the war, the German war machine, straining under the weight of its own over-engineered designs, managed to produce roughly 1,350 Tiger I tanks. Their frantic attempt at a more standardized, mass-produced medium-heavy tank, the Panther, yielded approximately 6,000 units before the factories fell silent. In stark contrast, the American automotive industry, fully mobilized and operating at the peak of its terrifying potential as the arsenal of democracy, churned out nearly 50,000 M4 Shermans. This was not merely a numerical advantage. It was an avalanche of steel. For every single Tiger tank that painstakingly rolled out of a German workshop, the Americans built 37 Shermans. When combined with the staggering output of over 80,000 Soviet T-34s, grinding toward Berlin from the east, the Axis powers were being crushed inside an inescapable global industrial vice. The mathematical disparity was so vast, so inherently insurmountable, that no amount of tactical genius, localized battlefield success, or heavily armored superiority could ever alter the final outcome. The German High Command's obsession with crafting the perfect, invincible weapon had fundamentally blinded them to the brutal reality of total war. They had built magnificent, terrifying masterpieces of armored engineering. But masterpieces could not hold a front line stretching for thousands of miles across 2 entire continents. As the Allied armies finally bridged the Rhine River and pushed deep into the German homeland, the ultimate, tragic consequences of this philosophical failure became impossible to ignore for the men left fighting in the rubble. The final reckoning of this industrial slaughter arrived not on a single battlefield, but across the crumbling infrastructure of the Third Reich. By the spring of 1945, the German armored corps was no longer a cohesive fighting force. It was a scattering of localized, desperate holdouts. The great beast of the Wehrmacht had not simply been outmaneuvered. It had been systematically starved to death. The skies over Germany were entirely dominated by Allied heavy bombers. The Ruhr Valley, once the beating industrial heart of the nation, had been reduced to a lunar landscape of ash-cratered concrete and twisted steel. The massive factory complexes of Krupp, Porsche, and Henschel, where the meticulous, artisanal crafting of the Tiger tanks once took place, now lay in absolute ruin. Roofs were caved in, exposing shattered machinery to the elements. Assembly lines were buried under thousands of tons of masonry. The master machinists, those who had survived the relentless day and night firestorms, were handed cheap disposable Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons and sent to the front lines as conscripted infantry. German tank production did not just slow down in those final months. It suffered a violent, catastrophic collapse. Even when a new Panther or Tiger miraculously rolled out of a surviving, heavily fortified underground facility, its existence was practically meaningless. The synthetic oil refineries at Luna and the natural oil fields of Ploesti had been obliterated. There was simply no fuel to move the heavy machines. Furthermore, the sprawling rail network required to transport these 60-ton behemoths had been shattered into useless, disconnected fragments by roaming squadrons of Allied fighter bombers. 4,000 miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, the contrast was staggering. The American industrial homeland remained entirely untouched by the ravages of war. In Michigan, Ohio, and New York, the factory lights burned brightly, illuminating the night sky without fear of enemy aircraft. There were no air raid sirens to halt the assembly lines. There were no critical shortages of steel, rubber, or copper. The foundries poured molten metal with a terrifying rhythmic consistency, operating in a relentless 3-shift rotation. The final production numbers of the Second World War tell the definitive story of a conflict decided not by elite individual prowess, but by overwhelming, industrialized mechanical output. Throughout the entirety of the war, the German war machine, straining under the weight of its own over-engineered designs, managed to produce roughly 1,350 Tiger I tanks. Their frantic attempt at a more standardized mass-produced medium-heavy tank, the Panther, yielded approximately 6,000 units before the factories fell silent. In stark contrast, the American automotive industry, fully mobilized and operating at the peak of its terrifying potential as the arsenal of democracy, churned out nearly 50,000 M4 Shermans. This was not merely a numerical advantage. It was an avalanche of steel. For every single Tiger tank that painstakingly rolled out of a German workshop, the Americans built 37 Shermans. When combined with the staggering output of over 80,000 Soviet T-34s grinding toward Berlin from the east, the Axis powers were being crushed inside an inescapable global industrial vice. The mathematical disparity was so vast, so inherently insurmountable, that no amount of tactical genius, localized battlefield success, or heavily armored superiority could ever alter the final outcome. The German High Command's obsession with crafting the perfect, invincible weapon had fundamentally blinded them to the brutal reality of total war. They had built magnificent, terrifying masterpieces of armored engineering. But masterpieces could not hold a front line stretching for thousands of miles across 2 entire continents. As the Allied armies finally bridged the Rhine River and pushed deep into the German homeland, the ultimate, tragic consequences of this philosophical failure became impossible to ignore for the men left fighting in the rubble. When the guns finally fell silent across Europe in the spring of 1945, the scarred battlefields were left to the scavengers and the historians. The rusting hulks of the King Tigers and Panthers, stranded in the mud and the melting snowdrifts, became monuments to a fatal arrogance. They stood as iron tombs for an empire that believed a technologically perfect weapon could somehow overcome an industrialized world. The German war machine was designed for the localized tactical duels of a bygone era, a type of war that simply no longer existed. The American M4 Sherman, by stark contrast, was not a masterpiece of individual craftsmanship. It was a masterpiece of collective human endeavor. Its legacy extends far beyond its armor thickness or the caliber of its gun. The Sherman represented a permanent paradigm shift in the history of human conflict. It proved that in the unforgiving crucible of modern total war, the true front line is not merely the bloody hedgerow or the freezing forest. It is the assembly line, the railhead, and the shipping lane. The men who crewed these American tanks bore a unique and heavy psychological burden. They knew intimately that they were driving machines vulnerable to enemy fire. They understood the terrifying, cold-blooded mathematics of their own survival. Yet, they pushed forward across a continent, sustained by the absolute certainty that if their tank was destroyed today, another would be waiting for them tomorrow, forged by the hands of their fellow citizens thousands of miles away, and delivered by a supply chain that never slept. The clash between the bespoke German heavies and the standardized American medium tanks was more than just a series of tactical engagements. It was the absolute death of military romanticism. It taught humanity a cold, enduring lesson about the nature of survival in the mechanized age. Wars are declared by politicians and fought by soldiers, but they are won by logistics. In the fiery, continent-spanning wreckage of the Second World War, ultimate victory was not secured by the sharpest sword. It was forged relentlessly and overwhelmingly by the unyielding hammer of the arsenal of democracy.